You just don't get it, do you? He says. You just don't get what's going on at all. Jesus is being pretty sharp in our gospel today. You just don't get it, do you? He says. You just don't get what's going on at all. First, you're critiquing John the Baptist because of his austerity, claiming that he is demon-possessed to go on like that. And then you criticize me, Jesus says, for some sort of party-going bonhomie, saying I'm a friend of tax collectors and sinners. You just don't get it. And following this line of thought, perhaps we can tell who in a generation doesn't get it. They're the ones who may be categorizing others, categorizing them as demons, like apparently Dominic Cummings, for instance, or as friends of sinners, like apparently anybody who dares utter words of mercy and forgiveness for those beyond the pale. And of course, people are often categorizing others because they don't belong to their group, their herd. Herds, as a rule, are not especially wise. And you see quite a bit of herd mentality around these days, not least, of course, in social movements that claim, we get it, we get what's wrong, what needs sorting, what needs calling out. And the tricky thing is that while often what's being called out is indeed in need of fixing, the environment, police brutality, sexism and so on, the herd is not necessarily best placed to fix anything. The herd doesn't stand still. It travels, wanders, migrates. And worse, as a herd of human beings, we have powerful cravings for novelty and for unanimity. You could call it solidarity, or you could call it a tendency to bully into conformity. It's the attitude that screams, you must attend to what I am attending to now. And if you don't, you've got a demon or you're a friend of sinners. Well, unlike Jesus' times, these days it's unlikely to be a powerful religious lobby screaming, you must attend to the Sabbath, or you must honour God's holy Jerusalem temple. But there's plenty of pressure to say, je suis Charlie, to take the knee, or to avoid plastic cups after a church service. None of which is bad, of course. But the problem when this manifests as the herd mentality is the hatred generated for anyone who won't, for any reason, join that herd. If Jesus is anything to go by, it can get you crucified. Whether it's Je suis Charlie, #MeToo, Black Lives Matter, whatever. You had better be fully on board, says the herd. And if you're not on board with whatever in September is on trend, boy, are you going to know about it. Again, please don't misunderstand me. I am not suggesting we shouldn't address society's racism, injustice, or oppressions of various kinds. But I am suggesting that we take Jesus seriously when he warns, you don't get it. And he addressed this to some of the wisest, some of the most upright, some of the most pious citizens of his day. If Jesus is right, we are very unreliable interpreters of the present. What we think is happening is, though we may not realize it until some time later, not necessarily what's really going on at all. This time might be the start of something truly momentous that we can't foresee right now because perhaps we're scared to death. And given this uncertainty, we might, at the very least, be careful about how we hold our being right, recalling that for human beings, one of the most difficult things is to be right without hurting others. to be right without hurting others. Nearly everyone I've ever met wants to be good. But I have to say, not a few of them were ready to do some bad stuff and to give you an explanation why, being a good person, it was necessary for them to do it. So where at this time is wisdom to be found? Well, funnily enough, Jesus goes on to talk about that too, saying, "You have hidden these things, O Father, from the wise and the intelligent, and revealed them to infants." Let me just give you an example from these times of pandemic that illustrates Jesus' point. True story. James Denny, so ill with COVID-19, just received the last rites as a Roman Catholic as he lay in a pressurised room in a hospital, having said goodbye to his family on FaceTime. When he had been less ill, the hospital ward cleaner, Rosora, had struck up a relationship with Jason. And today, as she went about her business in PPE, she could see the fear in his face. Jason hadn't wanted to be sedated or incubated and was, as a consequence, in unspeakable pain, focusing on surviving 5 minutes at a time. So she struck up another conversation with him. She kept talking to him. And amongst the things she said was, she told him his life was in good hands, both the doctor's and God's. Jason said later of the conversations, "I don't think she realised at the time what she was doing for me. She was saving my life. It was such a relief to talk about something other than my illness. I was sick and tired of hearing about what bad shape I was in." And Rosora said simply later, "I wanted to make sure that he knew he wasn't alone." Recent research suggests that invisible workers like Rosora can save lives. As one researcher put it, it only takes 40 seconds of a caring interaction to change a patient in a way that affects their whole health prospects. I was especially struck by Rosora's words to Jason, "You are in good hands." It's a phrase I came across recently when I heard how, in an interview just before he died, the distinguished scholar Huston Smith was asked what he had learned from 6 decades of studying, teaching, and living the religions of the world. And he replied, "What have I learned? I have learned that we are in good hands." These things are revealed to infants, Jesus says, which doesn't mean he's suggesting we try to become infants, but that we, as followers of Jesus, are just infants, beginners. So if we're in danger of not getting it, and we know that wisdom is to be found in the most counterintuitive of people, in infants of one form or another, then how are we to live wisely? Well, again, Jesus has something to say to this in our gospel. If we are weary and carrying heavy burdens, whether it is the burden of the fear of the pandemic, the burden of expectations upon us, or of workload beyond our capacity, or any other burdens, Jesus says, "Come unto me." Intentionally, come to me. And then he says, "Take my burden, my yoke upon you," which again seems counterintuitive. No rest here, no holiday, no air bridge to Sunsville, but being yoked to Jesus. And a yoke was a work tool for an animal, oxen typically. The younger ox has to get used to the older ox. If the younger works too hard, he takes all the weight on himself and can't last, but collapses. If he drags his feet, then eventually he'll fall and hurt himself. When Jesus says, "Take my yoke upon you," he's telling the disciples that you and I are to come and to walk his way with him, walking and living and moving and breathing with him. We can look at all this as burden, but Jesus suggests it isn't burdensome. It's in fact restful, easy, and light. How come? Well, because, for instance, no one holding on to anger says, "This is working great for me." Because no one is saying, "I refuse to forgive and it's a really good decision." Because no one is arguing, "Bitterness is just fine," when it's eating them alive. And much more. Two words I sometimes hear when engaging with churches and their leaders are tired and overwhelmed. Yet Jesus tells us that in and with him there is ease, lightness, and rest. There is something unhooked here, something unhooked from the yoke of Jesus that we need to re-hook. I haven't time here to expand on those key words of Jesus, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me." But what seems clear from the drift of Jesus' teaching in our gospel today is that we might well not get what's going on. But if so, that's okay. Pay attention to the little ones in this world. Learn from this littleness, and whatever you do, yoke yourself to Jesus.